Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric of Story. Thank you for joining me again for our exploration of the 7 basic elements of compelling, powerful, immersive storytelling. Today we're moving on to the second of those 7 elements. We're thinking about the rhetoric of story, which we've defined as a way of structuring stories that mirrors the way that our minds work and the way that we see the world around us. To make sense of the world, of all the changes that are going on, we tell a story about the world and we place ourselves at the center of that story. And this is why when we mirror through the structure of story, this way that our mind works, the stories become very, very compelling because we place ourselves into the center of the story that's being told, if the storyteller has done their job right. We thought in the last lecture about the idea of change, an archetypal human change, and at the heart of every really powerful, long-lasting story, and to illustrate this, we looked at the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, which we think might be as old as 5,000 years. It's lasted all that time because of the change it talks about, which is the archetypal change from boy to man, from young person to mature adult. And we looked at how that story illustrates that change and how it threads through every part of the story, because once we have that archetypal human change in place, everything the story does, every scene, every decision made by the characters, every exchange of dialogue, in some way or another, relates back to that change and gives the story a unity. We also thought about the 2 kinds of story that are in every story, the big story, the small story, the epic outer change, for instance in Die Hard, fighting terrorists, which is balanced and made more powerful by the small inner story, the change of the character John McClane reclaiming his wife and family, a powerful archetypal story. But at the heart of the story, whatever change we're exploring, however powerful, complex it is, that change must be happening to somebody. At the center of every story is a hero, we might call them a protagonist, a central character, a person, is a self. There's a self experiencing everything in the story, and it's this self that we go into as the reader, as the audience of the story. And that's the idea we're going to be exploring through today's talk, the idea of self and how it sits at the heart of powerful storytelling. Cast your mind back some 2,500 years to the Greek city of Thebes, which was one of the great city-states of classical Greece. And Thebes is in a terrible position. Thebes is afflicted with a drought. The crops have died in the fields because of lack of water, and the people of Thebes are starving. And they do what the people of the Greek city-state would do. They go to their king, the great king Oedipus, and they say, Oedipus, we believe in some way the city of Thebes has offended the gods, and you as our king need to investigate and find out what lies at the heart of this problem. It's your responsibility. And Oedipus says, you're right, I am the king of Thebes, I take on this responsibility and I will investigate what we have done to offend the gods. And so to his chambers Oedipus calls the blind philosopher Tiresias. Tiresias comes holding a stick, and he is completely blind and blindfolded. Tiresias sees on a level beyond sight. And Oedipus says, Tiresias, what have we done to offend the gods? And Tiresias responds, you don't want to know. Don't ask me this question, Oedipus. It leads to places that you are not ready to explore. And Oedipus explodes in fury and says, I demand, Tiresias, that you tell me what you know about this situation. And Tiresias says, okay, This problem is caused by an outsider to the city of Thebes, and he has offended the gods by murdering his father and sleeping with his mother. And Oedipus is shocked and terrified by this news. When he was a young man, Oedipus was told that a prophecy existed that he would indeed murder his father and sleep with his mother, two great crimes. And to escape the fate of this prophecy, Oedipus fled from the city of Corinth, where he was raised, and he fled along the road to Thebes in his chariot. But his path was blocked by another man, a cruel, arrogant man. And Oedipus fought this man, and he killed him. And the road was free, and Oedipus continued to the city of Thebes. And Oedipus finishes this story, and his wife, the queen of Thebes, Jocasta, responds and says, "Oedipus, my husband was killed by a strange man on the road to Corinth in his chariot, and I think that man was you, and I think you have murdered my husband, who was married to me before we were wed." And Oedipus says that can't be possible. So he summons one final witness to his chambers, and that witness is a messenger, an old man who for all his life has carried messages for the city of Thebes and done the bidding of its king. And Oedipus says, "Old man, what do you know of this mystery?" And the old man says, "As a young man, the king of Thebes then, Laius, gave me his firstborn son, a baby, and told me to take it into the wilderness and kill it, because there had been a prophecy that this baby, when it grew, would murder his father Laius and sleep with his mother Jocasta." And upon hearing this story, Oedipus finally understood the truth, because he, as a young child, had been found in the wilderness, left for the wolves, and adopted by his family in Corinth. And now Oedipus finally understood what his crime was. He didn't know himself. Know thyself. One of the most famous and most important ideas in the whole field of philosophy, most commonly attributed to the Greek philosopher Socrates. What does it mean to know yourself, and how do you know yourself? This is the question that Socrates is putting to his audience through this statement, know thyself. What does it mean for Oedipus? At the centre of the story of Oedipus, Oedipus the king, Oedipus Rex, which is a 2,500-year-old play by the playwright Sophocles, which was presented to Greek audiences and embodied many of the values of their society. At the centre of this play is Oedipus's lack of self-knowledge. There's a major fact about his own life that Oedipus doesn't know, which is his parentage. And in Greek society, parentage was very important. It was seen to determine your whole fate, who your father was particularly. And Oedipus doesn't know that his father is Laius, and Laius has committed a great sin by throwing his only son out into the world, and has, by committing that sin, brought true the prophecy that he will be killed by his son. And this is the core of the Greek tragedy. The thing about the central character that they're not aware of in themselves, their lack of self-knowledge. We have a more complicated view of the world. We don't believe that everything is about who our parents are, but we're posed with an equally difficult question. How do we know ourselves? Everything that we see comes through our eyes. Everything that we hear comes through our ears. Everything that we can feel or sense comes through our hands and our sense of touch. So, unavoidably, however we see the world, we're always at the centre of it. So to truly understand the world, we have to know ourselves. And that self today is a complicated idea. And many people in the world believe in the idea of a soul. So you are determined by the unique soul that is placed into you, possibly by God. Many other people believe in the idea of karma, which is quite similar to the Greek idea of the fates. Your actions will bring about a certain direction in your life. So if you do sinful things, your karma will turn bad and you will experience bad events in your life. In the Western modern world, we're more driven by psychological and cognitive ideas of self, that the circumstances that we're placed into, be it a position of high birth or great poverty, or the people we're surrounded by, have a great impact and shape our behaviour, and our storytelling tends to reflect this. And we're all faced with the task as storytellers of answering these hard questions of life. Why do people do the often strange and crazy, or perhaps wonderful and beautiful, and sometimes deeply self-destructive things that people do? Why do Romeo and Juliet kill themselves over a youthful love affair that most people might simply grow out of? Why does Hamlet end up killing everybody in his family? These are the big questions that dramatic stories explore. In the recent novel We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver explores a powerful question in modern society that we find very hard to face. Why do some parents not love their children? And in the inverse of that, why do we love our children at all? What is the power and energy behind this? And these are all the really deep questions that great storytelling explores, and it does it in the most powerful way by diving inside a human experience, placing that experience at the center of the story as a self. Why do people do the things they do? This is the mystery at the heart of every great piece of storytelling. And whenever we sit down to start work on a story, we think about the central character, the hero, the self that we're putting at the center of this story, we're asking the same question. Why is this person going to go on this epic quest, this internal odyssey, whatever the style or shape of the story might be? This question is, why is this person going to do any of this? And the most common answer that as storytellers we give, because it's a profound part of the human psyche, is we give the character a great and powerful desire. It's something they want to achieve in the world, a motivation, if you will. Think about the character of Rocky Balboa, in the famous late 70s boxing movies, written by and directed by Sylvester Stallone. And the character of Rocky, when we meet him, is a bum. He's a boxer, but he's washed up. He doesn't fight real fights anymore. He throws fights for money. He's a nobody. And almost entirely at random, the current boxing champion, Apollo Creed, selects Rocky to be his next opponent. Apollo's coming towards the end of his career. He doesn't want a tough fight. He's a showman. He wants to be able to get in the ring and show off with a fighter who's not going to pose him too much of a challenge. So he picks Rocky Balboa, the Italian stallion. And now from nowhere, Rocky has a shot. He's a loser, and he has a shot at being the champ. Rocky has a trainer, Mick, and they set about training. But Rocky just can't put his heart and soul into the effort. He doesn't want it enough. He has a new young wife, Adrian, and they're having a baby. And during the training process, there's an argument, and Adrian almost has a miscarriage. And the situation is tense, and Rocky might be about to lose everything that actually he values most in the world. And he's prepared to get rid of everything. He's prepared to kick the fight to one side, throw the fight, so that he can have what he really wants in life, the woman that he loves and a family. But then as Adrian awakes from her coma, she says to Rocky the now famous words, "Win, Rocky, win." And we go into one of the all-time great montages in film history of Rocky running upstairs and he's being chased by children through the neighborhoods of the parts of the city where he lives. And it's in that moment, Rocky then goes on to almost win the World Championship of Boxing. Not quite. He gives Apollo Creed such a run for his money that a rematch is set up and they get to make a second Rocky movie. But the whole film hangs on the moment that we see explicitly within the story when Rocky's desire for victory is formed. And if we don't see that moment, and if it's not properly shaped, we don't really empathize with the character of Rocky, and we wouldn't immerse ourselves properly within his story. So seeing and understanding how Rocky's desire is shaped is really important. And there are parts to this desire. On one hand, you have the boxing match that Rocky is going to go on to almost win, and he's going to prove to be a true champion in heart in the process. But there's something more fundamental underlying this, and that's deep down Rocky has a desire to be a winner. He has a desire to fulfill his potential in the world, and all humans have this desire. However lost or hidden it might seem, however difficult our circumstances, we all have this basic desire to achieve something in the world, to be what we can be, to be the champion on some level. And it's because the Rocky story taps into this desire that it's so powerful for us, and people have been going back to the cinema and their television screens to watch Rocky again and again and again for decades now. The desires that we give to the characters in our stories really manifest on two levels. If we go back to the story of Oedipus, Oedipus has a conscious desire to solve the mystery of how Thebes has offended the gods, and therefore what is causing the desperate situation that the city finds itself in. And this conscious desire plays out in a number of ways. Firstly, Oedipus summons Tiresias. This doesn't satisfy his needs, so he speaks to his wife, Jocasta. This also doesn't solve the mystery, so he brings in the messenger. Each of these have given him a different clue, and this eventually builds up to the climax of the story. This is very similar in many ways to Jack and the Beanstalk from our last talk. Jack climbs up the beanstalk and there's a number of items that he finds. These are all the conscious desires of the character, but they're driven by something more powerful that lies underneath, and that's the unconscious desire. In Rocky, the unconscious desire that Rocky isn't quite aware of is to fulfill his life potential, and this is played out in the conscious desire of winning the match against Apollo Creed. In Oedipus, the unconscious desire is for the character to know himself, and this is again one of our basic desires and drives as a human, is to understand who we are and see the parts of ourselves that we're blind to by the way that we see and form our ideas of the world. You can place this in a much more action-oriented sense to get a better idea of it in a James Bond movie, for instance. James has the conscious desire to go and defeat the enemy of the British state. And he's sent on a mission, and he goes to a series of locations as a new clue is revealed in each part of the story. And this is how his conscious desires play out. But in a really powerful James Bond story, for instance, Casino Royale, which I think is the best Bond movie, we're given a hint of what James's unconscious desire is. And that unconscious desire is formed by the fact that James is an orphan, and he's attached his sense of well-being and safety to the British state, and therefore he will go on the kind of missions that most people won't, because it feels almost like he's saving his family in the process. And it's this interplay of the conscious and the unconscious desire that gives the self that we place at the center of the story, its drive, it's the engine that pushes the story forward. And if we haven't, on some level, ourselves, whether consciously or unconsciously as writers, put these desires into place, that engine will be missing from the story. And it's the most common reason that stories fail. They lack the drive within the central character that comes from a deep desire, which in turn gives the character their willpower. From the central desire that we give to a character and its conscious and unconscious levels comes the real force that drives them through the events of the story, which is their willpower. The playwright David Mamet defines willpower as the single most compelling quality of any character in a novel, a film, a stage play, any form of storytelling. It's the willpower that keeps bringing the character back to difficult situations to achieve their desire that drives the story along. Consider again the character of James Bond. Imagine a character with less willpower who's sent on a mission to defeat Spectre, the secret, all-powerful criminal organization that manipulates the world. If you or I were sent on this mission, firstly, we'd be terrified, and secondly, we would run away. And however great our desire, we might still run away. Not everybody is born a James Bond heroic, archetypal character. And it's James's willpower. It's the fact that if there is a car chase at 150 miles an hour, James will drive the car at 160 to win the chase. If he finds himself fighting a guy who's 1.5 feet taller than him, James will just fight harder. And this is all an aspect of the unique willpower that drives the character along. But it doesn't have to be in a purely action-oriented heroic sense. If we look again at Oedipus. Oedipus doesn't face physical challenges during the course of the play. Earlier in his life, he has killed a man who turns out to be his father. Oedipus's challenge is psychological because he knows very early on in the play that this is about him. And it would be much easier not to face the situation that he finds himself in. At the end of the play, Oedipus is blinded. And in fact, his willpower has driven him to a state of self-destruction, although in the model of the Greek tragedy, that self-destruction later on in the later Oedipus plays leads to his enlightenment and his wisdom as a blind seer. And again, it's the willpower that Oedipus possesses which allows him to pursue the play. So we're always dealing with characters who have a level of willpower beyond the normal. And that's one of the elements that makes the storytelling experience so profound for us, whether it's watching James Bond chase an adventure through circumstances that we wouldn't be able to deal with, whether it's watching King Oedipus pursue the clues of the tragedy. And this can also be brought into much more modern, realistic situations. David Mamet, who made this statement about willpower, one of his great stage plays turned into a screenplay, Glengarry Glen Ross, is really a story all about the nature of human will and the power that comes from it. We're placed into a sales team. We don't quite know what they're selling, real estate and other things attached to it. And this is a failing sales team. It's a bunch of guys, late 30s, middle-aged, with families. They're trying to earn a living and they're selling to do that. And they all want the best leads, the Glengarry Glen Ross leads, because the salesman with the best leads gets the most sales. And each of these characters, we have the oldest man, it's played by Jack Lemmon, and he was once a great salesman. He once had great willpower, and now he's on the final leg. He's trying to make money for his daughter's operation. She's terminally ill and he needs to pay for her operation, but he can't make the sales. His will is broken by the situation he's in. There are younger men in the sales team who simply don't have the power of will to hack it. One of the Baldwin brothers, Alec Baldwin, turns up as a top salesman from out of town, and he gives them a speech. And the speech is all about imposing his will over those men in the sales team. The lead salesman in the team, played by Al Pacino, goes through a long sequence of scenes where he convinces some poor sap to buy this worthless piece of land. And the drama all turns on our observation of how much more powerful Al Pacino's will is than the man he's negotiating with. All it's a wonderful drama, all driven by these different ideas and models of what it is to be strong-willed and to have willpower, and how much this sits at the heart of all the stories that we tell. When we find ourselves really in love with a story, when we're drawn into the world that the story creates, and it becomes, for the time that we're reading that book or watching that film, the reality that we seem to be inhabiting, it's because, more often than not, the self at the centre of that story has convinced us of its reality, and we treat that self as a real person. And in fact, for the time that we're engaged with the story, we immerse ourselves inside that self, and we become that person and share all of their experiences through the events of the story as it unfolds. For that to happen, there is a small dog behind me. I don't know where it's come from. For that to happen, we need to understand the desire, conscious and unconscious, that is driving the character along. We need to see the formation of that desire, ideally, and we see this in the character of Rocky Balboa. We see the moment when his desire to win the championship and become the great boxing champion is formed. We need to feel the strength of the will driving that character along, whether it's in a heroic adventure story like James Bond, or a much more down-to-earth narrative like Glengarry Glen Ross. But the thing that's really hooking us at the heart of this self, at the centre of the story, is what the self is becoming. This is really, really important in storytelling, because humans, as social creatures, one of the things that our brain is continually modelling is how we're changing, picking up on this first element of the rhetoric of story, and what it is that we are becoming and what the people around us are becoming. So there's a whole part of our mind which is really dedicated to watching this happening in the world around us, and so we're continually watching it in the stories that we go to the cinema to see, that we pick up books to read. In the classic novel Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, we are introduced to the young woman Becky Sharp, who's the self at the centre of the story. Becky is an orphan. We could speculate that her deep desire is to overcome her sense of isolation as an orphan child, which pulls her through her whole life. And this manifests as her conscious desire, initially, to find a rich husband, which will give her the place in society that she wishes to claim. This unconscious and conscious desire give her a strong willpower to go through the many challenges which she's going to face in achieving this. And it's a willpower that leads her in many ways to do the wrong thing. Vanity Fair is subtitled A Novel Without a Hero, and Becky Sharp is not a heroic character in the sense of James Bond or Rocky Balboa. She's a flawed, real human being. The things that Becky is trying to achieve are the things that many of us are trying to achieve, to climb in society, and through that we think we'll achieve happiness. We, as the readers, follow the story of Vanity Fair through all of the major transitions of Becky Sharp's life. Initially, she becomes a young debutante looking for the right husband within the society of the day. She moves on, she marries, and she becomes a mother. She's a rather cold, unfriendly mother to her son. She then climbs higher in society at the time, and she joins the aristocracy, and then she falls from that position, and she ends up among gamblers and card sharps. And we follow these transitions because we're fascinated, again, as humans, by how we all make these changes in life and how we become one kind of person after another. And while it was written over 2,000 years later than Oedipus the King, it's the same questing quality at the heart of Vanity Fair that drives us through, because just as Oedipus didn't know himself and was ignorant of his parentage, at the heart of the self in Vanity Fair of Becky Sharp is also a form of self-ignorance. Becky doesn't really understand that all the things she wants won't give her her real desire, which is to overcome her basic loneliness as an orphan. And that lack of self-knowledge makes Becky Sharp, like Oedipus, a tragic figure at the heart of the story, who continues to fail in achieving her real desires whilst chasing these conscious desires that are actually taking her very far away from who she would really like to be. When stories fail, when we walk out at the cinema auditorium, when we close the novel and never pick it up at that page again, it's almost always because the self at the centre of the story isn't strong enough to carry the story that we're building around them. And so we find ourselves, when we're working on a story, continually returning to the self and the questions that we need to ask of it in order to make it a strong and compelling character at the heart of the story. What is the desire, both the conscious and unconscious desire, driving this character along? How does their willpower manifest? What are the events of the story that they have to overcome in order for us to see fully into their willpower? This question at the heart of many of the great characters in fiction and storytelling. What is it that this character doesn't know about themselves, and what is it that they're questing for in order to understand themselves better? And these can help us to build a really powerful self at the heart of the story. But this is only one way of understanding this idea of self. And it's important to understand that this is how we can model the self in many stories. But what we're really doing is just arriving at one answer to these big questions of life. It can help us answer why Rocky Balboa wants to become the world boxing champion. It can help us answer why Oedipus the King is trying to solve the mystery of why the gods have been offended. It can help us understand why Becky Sharp is looking for the right marriage in the world and to climb in society. But ultimately, you as a writer are facing these really hard questions of life. Why are we the way that we are? And you will need to find your own models and answers to those questions.